How are you doing, Caesar?
I'm good, thanks.
All right. Sometimes it doesn't let everybody in at the same time, so we'll give it a minute or two. Looks like Sarah's coming in from Winchester, the UK. Very cool. Welcome. Um, Excited to have you. All right. Now it's starting to dump a few more people in. Looks like we have close to 100. Don't be shy. Feel free to put in the chat where you're from and what you're hoping to. It might be interesting to see what you're hoping to get out of this webinar. If you are that articulate at this time of day. Greece, Indiana, Sweden, very cool. We have a lot of people coming in from different places. India, okay. Portugal. I'll be in Portugal next month, I believe. So maybe we'll have to connect somehow. Boston, Massachusetts, Germany. Okay, very cool. Looks like we've got a worldwide audience. Toronto, Austria. Great to see everybody out there. All right. I think looks like everybody knows how to find the chat. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on integrating clinical strategy and project management for cost-effective clinical investigations. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's session, we plan to run for about 60 minutes in total, but we might stretch more depending on the amount of questions we get. So I want to give you a quick walkthrough of this interface that we do webinars on, this Goldcast. On the right side of your screen, you'll see a few tabs. You'll see chat. You should be able to see chat and Q&A. The chat is where you can engage with other attendees, post general comments, tell us where you're from. You can use emojis to wave at people. I always like seeing some engagement there. The Q&A tab, though, is where if you have a question that you want our presenter to answer, use the Q&A because sometimes it's hard for me to keep up with the chat. So use that Q&A if you have a question you specifically want to ask the presenters, Caesar or Bianca or Chris. But if you don't have a question, feel free to go over to that Q&A anyway, because you can vote on those questions. So if you see a question that's relevant to you, just vote it, and we'll try to prioritize the most highly voted questions. Another question we always get is, will you be sharing the recording and the slides? Yes, the recording and the slides will be shared with all registrants after the webinar. That will be coming in an email to you in the next few days, so keep an eye out for that. Now, I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. It's likely a similar mission as many of you joining us today. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. That means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping them there over time. We know the challenges that medical device face in this heavily regulated industry, and our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Greenlight Guru provides medical device companies with industry-leading quality management system and electronic data capture system solutions to scale faster, become more efficient, and reduce risk throughout the product lifecycle. So if you're interested in seeing why 1,200 of the world's leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru, head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and see a personalized demo. Today's, hold on, I'm getting some technical confusion here. Today's webinar, we're going to be discussing some of the most important aspects of a successful clinical investigation. One such aspect is clinical data and how you manage that data. So at Greenlight Guru, we've built the leading toolbox for medtech clinical data collection and management, specifically designed for medtech operations. Greenlight Guru Clinical is a single compliant platform for collection and management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. So if you're interested in learning more about this system and how it can help you streamline your clinical investigations, you can schedule a demo with us by clicking on the Get EDC button at the top of the screen and following link in the prompt. If you see that button in the top right, it says Get EDC Demo if you're interested in learning more. Now, let's turn our attention to today's presenters. Bianca Lutters is Head of Clinical Operations and Principal Consultants at Qserve. Bianca holds over 15 years of experience in the medical devices field, including a decade with prominent notified bodies, DECRA and BSI. Apologies if we practiced your first name, but I didn't practice your last name, so apologies if I messed that up, Bianca. You have to correct me. Caesar Roseboom is a clinical project manager at Qserve. Caesar brings nearly 7 years of experience in clinical investigations, and as a clinical project manager, Caesar oversees the planning, setup, and execution of clinical investigations for medical devices at Qserve. Chris Rush is a solutions engineer at Greenlight Guru, and Chris is a biomedical engineer. He's been in the medical device space for about 13 years, and he spent a number of years managing clinical studies for Class 3 devices and pivotal studies, PMA studies, and post-market registries. Now at Greenlight Guru, he showcases the value of our clinical data capture software to prospects. He also has appeared on our podcast, and you'll probably see him relatively often on these webinars, as he is on a lot of those. Okay, now, for the part you've all been waiting for, the featured content of today's webinar, it's my pleasure to hand it over to your presenters. So go ahead and take it away, Bianca.
Thank you, Etienne. If you can have the first slide, let me first talk a little bit about what Qserve is. Qserve is a medical device consultancy company that covers not only quality and regulatory, but also clinical for medical devices and IVD. We have offices in the US, the Netherlands, China, UK, Belgium, Germany, and Italy, and focus on global markets, being the EU, US, Canada, and China. And we have a quite large team with people from different countries that also bring in their own experience in specific fields, but also in specific countries. If you want to know more about us, please visit our website, qservegroup.com. That's what Etienne just did. He introduced us. What we talk about here as Qserve is just based on what we know. It's not the only way forward. My slides are messing up, Etienne.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. Okay. Let's see here.
I'm now at the correct slide. So let's see.
Okay.
Let's talk about the webinar. What we have done, we have divided it in 4 different sections. The first one is on clinical strategy and clinical study design. Then it really focuses on project management and how you can use that as a manufacturer to your advantage. Caesar will talk about that. Then data collection and software tools, where Chris will guide you. And then the last part is a case where we will discuss an example, a pre-market study, and try to explain in a little bit more detail what we feel is important and how you can, as a medical device manufacturer, sponsoring a clinical investigation, make your life as easy as possible from a regulatory perspective, but still end up with a study that is as efficient and especially as cost efficient as possible. The clinical strategy and clinical study design. The first question that I always ask myself at the moment I'm thinking about clinical strategy and clinical study design is, what are the regulatory requirements? Am I looking at one country or multiple countries? What are those countries? But also, if I think about regulatory requirements, which study are you doing? Are you doing a pre-market study, a post-market study? Is it a first-in-human study for a high-risk device, or is it just a pivotal study? That all determines what you are going to use as input for your study. For a first-in-human study, statistics are less important than when we are looking at a pivotal study, where you need to have a statistically justified sample size to ensure that you really have a scientific way to show that your device is safe and performs as intended. Post-market, you don't need to cover all requirements from, for example, documentation. For a post-market study, the investigator brochure can be in most cases waived just because the device is already on the market. So really understand, what is my study, why am I doing it, and what are the countries, because that really is important to understand what you need to do in practice. Um, then the most difficult part for many manufacturers, because you need to start thinking about endpoints. Um, and we can all come up with many options to define endpoints. But where do you begin? And why is something relevant and why is something else not relevant? And what you see in the European Medical Device Regulation has here and there some words that say we need to have patient-related safety and performance characteristics, basically clinical endpoints. And that's what they also want to see in the clinical evaluation, which is in line with what the FDA is doing. So you see that all over the world, it's really getting more similar on what countries are looking at. Is it always the same? No, but at least it's getting more similar. Um, but if you then want to define those endpoints, where do I start? The first thing we always start with is, but what is my product description? What are my claims? What's my intended use? Because that's basically, this is what I plan that my product can do. And then we need to have evidence to support that your product is indeed able to do that. Um, what you usually do to start to understand what is a good endpoint is look at other devices, competitor devices, or alternative devices, or if there are no devices used, which also happens, what is the current medical practice? Um, and then based on that, um, define a literature search, appraise the literature, and look based on that literature for performance endpoints and acceptance criteria and safety endpoints and acceptance criteria. And a performance endpoint means nothing else than, is the device doing what it's supposed to do? If you have a heart valve that should stop leaking of regurgitation of blood, then that's one of the endpoints. If you have a heart valve, you want to avoid that there is infection, that there is endocarditis. That's a safety endpoint. And the safety endpoint for a higher risk device, and that's what we are usually talking about if we talk about clinical studies, is not, we want to have only in 5% of the cases no adverse events or serious adverse events. It's really specific at the level of infection, endocarditis, any safety issues you see. Then based on that state-of-the-art information, you can determine what is acceptable, yes or no. Because if you know that the current medical practice has only in 5% of the cases a major adverse event, whether that's infection or a patient death or whatever is relevant for your device, you need to be meeting that acceptance criterion, or you need to be better. Don't tell me if you see that 1% of your patients dies with a very high risk device in the state of the art in the current medical practice, that it is acceptable that in your case 2% of the patient dies. That's not acceptable. Then you are not state of the art. So really also use that. This is what the current medical practice is, and I only can be better or the same. There is no way I can be worse. Um, at the moment, you have your state of the art, your endpoints. If you are smart, you already document that in your clinical evaluation plan and in your clinical evaluation report. Even though they are drafts, that's what you need for Europe to go to the market in the end. And then you only need to update it. Going back to the same papers and redoing the same assessment because you need to write another piece of text, that's a pity. If you are really smart, you use your state-of-the-art text from the CER in your clinical investigation plan and in your investigator brochures. Maybe not identical, but at least very similar. But if you have identified those endpoints, you can really start to do your pre-market study and then add the clinical data to your clinical evaluation report, which means that you are ready to submit for market access in Europe. Please also ensure that you justify why you have chosen a specific design. And then if we are thinking about a design, think on, do I have only my product, so a single arm study, or do I have a randomized controlled clinical investigation, also directly comparing to a competitor product? If you don't have a control group, make sure it's justified. You can definitely justify this, especially in Europe, if you have sufficient information on state of the art. If there is not sufficient information on state of the art, you need to have a control group. But that's really what you are looking at. I just spoke mainly about pre-market studies, but in principle, what we do in a pre-market study with a clinical evaluation, then define endpoints, acceptance criteria, generate clinical data, is not different from what you can do in a post-market study, but it's the same what you do in a much simpler PMCF user survey, where you are really looking at data that are already there, retrospectively collected. And in all cases, it starts with the clinical evaluation, endpoints acceptance criteria, collecting clinical data, and then really go back to the clinical evaluation again. Are we sufficiently safe and is the device performing as intended? Then the sample size. Especially if you are looking at a pivotal study or at a post-market study, PMCF survey, it's very important because it's the scientific basis of demonstrating that your device is safe and performs as intended. And there are a couple of things that you need to take into account. The first thing is the study design. Do I have a randomized controlled trial? Do I have a single arm study? Do I need to compare the two groups, or do I need to compare to literature state of the art? You have your hypothesis. My device is the same or better, being a non-inferiority study. My device is better, being a superiority study, usually requiring a higher sample size. What are your acceptance criteria? And what, based on the state of the art? And what's the expected performance of your device? If you expect that your device is brilliant compared to the state of the art, and that's indeed the case, the sample size is lower than when your device is just a little bit better than the state of the art. But keep in mind, if you need to really show that your device is the same or better in a clinical investigation, you can think that your expected performance of your device is brilliant. But if that's not the case in practice, you underestimate your sample size. Be aware of that, and that means that you may fail your primary endpoint. So that's what you want to avoid. Expected performance, be realistic, because otherwise you will have a sample size that's not enough to support your hypothesis. When are you thinking and actual practice on the clinical investigation planning. Very early on, if you look at this picture, it has in year 1 and year 2 design and development, verification testing, the manufacturing process validations, and the design freeze. Then in year 3, you start with the reviews by the competent authorities and the ethics committees, clinical study, enroll your patients at the moment you are having the proper approvals and notifications, follow up in your clinical study, and then analyze and report your data. Prepare a technical documentation if you are looking at submitting to an authority, a regulatory authority for market access. And then hopefully, based on those clinical data, you get access to the market. If I know that I have a device, I would start with the state of the art very early. Usually, there is one thing that management is interested in, and that's it's nice that you want to develop a new product. What's the business case? Can we earn sufficient money with this device? A very important question. But knowing that the clinical investigation is one of the most expensive parts, usually, of a design and development project, understanding what the approximate costs are will really help to make that business case. So start early with the state of the art. Define an initial sample size. And that may be on even on a very simple state of the art, just looking at a couple of important papers. That may be based on your initial data in design and development, understanding the performance of your device, but you want to have a ballpark. And from that ballpark, during your design and development process, you should be able to upgrade your state of the art, especially if it's a novel device. Maybe get more data on competitor devices in your state of the art, and in the end, finalize your sample size. This is very nice in theory, but I can tell you the practice is not always as simple as the theory seems. And that's what Caesar will guide you through. How does this work in practice? What do I need to understand to not only talk regulatory language, but also to be able to talk clinical study language?
Yes. So, so when we're talking about clinical investigation, your aim is to collect good quality data. With that, we mean compliant data, so compliant with the protocol, and complete data sets. And there are basically three drivers that you can consider that are feeding into the good quality data. That's first, a protocol or a clinical investigation plan that translates into practice and sites are happy with working. The sites themselves, of course, because they are the people, or that is where the data is coming from. They have to enter the data into your database. So that's the third part. Chris will cover that part. So let's dive into the first. Let's see. The first part, which is the clinical investigation plan. And so the aim of this webinar is not necessarily giving you a lot of pointers for clinical investigation plan management throughout the study, but maybe more upfront, the design of a protocol. That is where it starts with a well-designed protocol that translates into practice will make you make your life a lot easier, basically. And after you've come to put together a synopsis, so a summary of your plan that includes sample size, as Bianca mentioned, the endpoints, eligibility criteria, even if that still needs to be fine-tuned, then if you haven't already started involving clinical experts, now is the time. And with clinical experts, they are usually physicians that utilize your device or the technical staff. And they understand very well the standard of care. A protocol that adheres to the standard of care, we would highly promote, because that makes the life of sites a lot easier. They understand that workflow. They're familiar with all assessments. All assessments is part of the standard of care you usually don't have to cover for. and anything that is then additional. So in light of the study being asked, it's a lot easier to organize. A disruptive protocol, adversely, is doing the opposite. It is a snowball effect of usually issues. So think sites will find a lot of problems, maybe have incomplete data sets. There's maybe logistical issues, queries in the system. Patients might not even want to participate because they feel like they're guinea pigs, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a snowball effect of issues, and sites may also end up being a bit hesitant to enroll patients because they know it's trouble. So, long story short, understand the follow-up, the standard of care and follow-up that is part of the standard of care, and try to adhere to that as much as you can. That will increase the data quality, of course, but also even if there are issues throughout the study, and you already know up front, you can anticipate any logistical challenges or challenges in general. And there might also be differences amongst countries. The clinical experts here would probably understand because they understand their field, they know their colleagues, even abroad or across borders. So they can help you very much in this. It's often undervalued, if I may say so. And then the third point here is to define the eligibility criteria. Of course, you have a good idea already when you have put together a SIP synopsis, but the physicians in the field, they understand very well what patient population they are seeing and if it is a feasible plan. So you may be able to tackle challenges. Again, if you can anticipate them, that's always better than to know somewhere down the line or downstream the process. So then the second part, The second part is, of course, the clinical investigation sites and how to select them. In our experience at Qserve, we see that it's often a little bit undershadowed, but it's very common and good practice also to perform proper site qualification visits, and not only asking about volume and if sites are equipped and are happy to participate, but really put together site qualification criteria. If you have put together at least, this is, by the way, a good moment to start doing already or putting together. By the time you have a draft of the protocol that's almost final, you can put together qualification criteria, document them properly. It will help and aid your site qualification visits because you'll have targeted questions to address. Some can even be addressed remotely, so per email, for instance, in a form of questionnaire, for instance. And you'll not be wasting a lot of physicians' time as well. And if you keep documenting this entire process, the end, so the site selection process will be also a little bit more, or a lot more, unbiased. So you will be able to select the best fitting sites instead of, let's say, looking at whether a site is having a key opinion leader, because not only the key opinion leader being there is relevant to your site, to your study. And of course, the top here, I forgot to mention, the amount of sites is, of course, driven by total number of patients, the volume that is at site, and what patients are then going to be willing to participate, etc. So think about at this stage also how many sites you would want to address, how many sites you would like to involve, and also countries. And then this is the next slide is about giving you pointers on what you can address during such a qualification visit. It's obvious when you already have experience with centers that you know are good, are happy to work with you. Still, I would recommend to perform a site qualification visit, still document it. And then you can look at the site's feasibility. So whether they're equipped, do they have everything, all the resources? So do they have enough manpower, etc. And are they qualified to perform this study? And then during these kind of conversations, you can still obtain a lot of invaluable information from the staff on site because they're the ones performing or conducting the study. So anything is very, very useful. And you can anticipate, and you can also facilitate running the study if there are issues. It does not necessarily mean it's a problem. It's always a good thing, I would say, especially if you get that feedback, because it's meaning the site is engaged already. They already are willing to participate, let's say. And then, of course, site volume, I mentioned it already. Also, contract and approval processes, they usually understand very well the process if they are experienced with clinical investigations, and they can give you pointers to help you minimize the timeline or time needed in order to be able to activate the center. So I already mentioned the key opinion leaders. Of course, it's a factor. Everybody understands it. But if you document the entire site selection process properly, then you can probably put this also in there and put it in a certain priority, but it's not the only factor. And then other items could be like competitive studies. If a site would have competitive studies now or in the future running that are looking for the same patient population, well, that definitely would affect also your study. While this is not an exhaustive list, it's just to give you some pointers, what to think of and what to discuss. And do keep in mind that the sites are the ones providing you the data. So a proper site selection process, as stipulated here, can make a huge impact on the quality of data obtained and also at the speed with which the data is obtained. Think about query resolution, etc. And then I just want to point out after we see our clients want to go to multiple countries, and they forget that for each country, a process, their own process needs to be followed. Some countries, for instance, still use paper formats to provide the submission package with wet ink signatures. Others have their own digital platform. So there's different processes. In short, I can summarize it to really consult with somebody that has experience with medical devices in the startup phase. So obtaining approval, call it a startup specialist, because here with this, to ensure a smooth process and to submit a package that is not going to lead to many problems or many questions, the devil is in the details. So yeah, I would advise consult with a specialist, because adding a country also is associated with more focus. So not only at the startup phase does it require more budget, let's say, it costs money, of course, and time, but also throughout the study to realize that it's extra work, let's say, and focus, and that shouldn't be hampering the quality overall, of course. So then to come back to this slide Bianca just showed about the timing of everything. I'm not sure if you can read the light blue bars here. My screen is quite small, but I can summarize it as that is, of course, you have to finalize your protocol and preferably many of the other documents required for submission, but that is beyond this webinar to discuss. Before the green bar, and this green bar says EC and competent authority review and approval. So of course, everything comes before that. The bottom line here, or the take-home message, is you can start early already. You can already do things simultaneously. So like I mentioned at the beginning of my part, when you have a good understanding of what you want to achieve and you put together a SIP synopsis. So then to link with Chris's part, the aim is, of course, good quality clinical data. Chris, you can take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Caesar. My name is Chris. I'm a solutions engineer here with Greenlight, and I'll be talking about data collection, software tools that can really assist with data collection, and some of the considerations when designing case report forms, considerations when it comes to study design and how that fits into the technology solutions, electronic data capture tools, for instance, that you might consider using. So a couple things I want to touch on. Compliance, of course, will be one. Design of case report forms, and then overall study design and some of those considerations specific to software technologies, specifically electronic data capture software tools. In terms of compliance, any EDC system, any electronic data capture tool really needs to be compliant or facilitate compliance with all the GCP standards, and I've listed a number of them here. The ISO standards for device 14155, for IVD 20916, ICH GCP, really important for compliance to be built into these solutions. for guardrails to essentially assist with complying with these automatically without having to manually do a lot to ensure compliance. Consent, oftentimes very important in studies. So I've listed FDA CFR 21 Part 11. That's the electronic signature regulation. Having tools that can capture signatures for especially consent, really important, especially if your study will be utilizing consent, but also having an extensive audit log of all activity within a system. This should all really be built in there. Patient privacy as well, of course, EU GDPR, here in the US, the HIPAA requirements. Having this type of compliance built into the system will also, again, make it seamless for capturing data in Europe, maybe today, maybe in the US later, but really having a system that has that facilitates compliance in a global manner. So seeking those when you're considering software tools, when you're considering electronic data capture tools specifically. And then I want to talk a little bit about just design of eCRF, and then I'll talk about study design considerations. So as you're designing case report forms, I've also listed in one of the bullets here, ePRO's patient-reported outcomes. So eCRFs traditionally are going to be completed by clinicians. Patient-reported outcomes typically completed by subjects. Really defining that first bullet point, which fields are mandatory, must be captured, and then also defining, are there any optional fields that you're okay with if you're not capturing that data 100%? Really defining that not only in your data management plan, but also reflecting the rigor of those requirements or the lack thereof, if it's an optional field, for instance, within the electronic system, allowing the system to automatically maintain accountability for completeness of mandatory fields. Electronic systems should be able to really build that accountability in to the system and really make that a something that you don't have to manage too directly in terms of making sure that fields are complete. The systems can catch that for you. Caesar mentioned this a little bit before, keeping the end user in mind. He was talking about clinicians. That's certainly true. Ensuring that the data capture for each of your visits really reflects the reality of standard practice clinically, the standard clinical workflow. So really having physician review of your eCRFs as early as possible. Your clinical collaborators, your clinical partners looking at the data forms that you're considering and getting feedback for those. Alternatively, for patient-reported outcomes, it's obviously a little bit different. These are subjects completing data. Their familiarity with clinical jargon may not be quite to the same level as a clinician. So designing ePROs that are really optimized for a layperson to not only understand the questionnaire, understand the questions that are being asked of them, but also ensuring that it's not too much of a time burden to complete patient-reported outcomes. Also, when it comes to electronic data capture tools, patient-reported outcome measures can be sent electronically to subjects via email, via text message, and really ensuring that workflow for the end subject user to receive those materials, open those materials, complete those materials is very easy. That should be functionality that's built into any EDC that you're considering, if there's especially an ePRO element. And then back to the eCRF clinician interface, user friendliness of the interface for clinical data entry is obviously of high importance as well. Designing your eCRF electronically allows you to, this third bullet point, utilize validation checks, to utilize dynamic fields. Essentially what this enables you to do is you can have the system, the software tool, validating the data that's being entered in real time, giving feedback. This value is outside of expected range, please confirm. The system can auto-generate queries based on responses. So having a software tool automate a lot of that activity for you, you can build that into your eCRF electronically, having the system validate data in real time, as well as dynamic fields, making forms dynamic, where if a data entry participant enters a response to a question, based on that response, there may be specific questions that apply or do not apply based on that response. And those systems can present questions that apply, hide questions that do not apply. And designing your eCRFs electronically in a way that really optimizes the time of the end user, so they're not presented with questions that don't apply. And then, of course, permissions with any electronic software tool for data capture. we'll all be able to control who can enter data, who can view data, who can edit data. So again, building that into the system, ensuring those guardrails are in place to ensure those that are responsible for data entry are doing so, and those that are not are simply not able to. Some high-level study design considerations as you're considering different software tools. So CRF design, very specific for the forms, but overall study design, certain software tools are optimized for certain study designs and may fall short in others. Is your study going to be single site, multi-center, decentralized? So will this be a decentralized study with participants from numerous institutions? You don't have, 7 or 8 specific sites. Maybe it's a national study, that sort of thing. Can the system reflect the needs of that study design in that electronic software tool? Randomization, again, may or may not apply for your studies. That needs to be built in there. Can the system handle the randomization requirements of your study? And then things like cohorts. Are we examining certain cohorts within our enrollments? And how do we monitor? How do we have visibility into enrollment within those cohorts? Software tools can be very powerful in terms of data management, having visibility into progress of enrollment, et cetera. And then lastly here, public enrollment. This oftentimes applies for like post-market studies. Software tools are able to very well enable the tool to capture data from a public forum, if you will. So having a URL on your website seeking device feedback in a post-market setting, can the system handle that type of data capture as well? So just some considerations here, high-level study design, specifically for eCRFs, and of course the compliance piece. And with that, I'll pass it back to the team here.
Let me first unmute before I start talking. The case, as promised, a pre-market study. It's a novel device because it's not containing animal tissue. It's a class 3. It's a totally fictive device, so it doesn't exist. It's used in various surgical procedures to stop bleeding, with as clinical benefit that it helps to achieve hemostasis. And the claims are that it achieves hemostasis within 5 minutes, is absorbed in the body within 4 weeks, and that the device-related complications are minimal. And keep in mind what I said before. Usually for a class 3 device, you can put them on one big pile. You really need to find the most important individual complications. Thinking about clinical endpoints, the first one, achieve hemostasis in less than 5 minutes, or equal or less than 5 minutes. You have 2 options. Option 1 is the success rate to achieve hemostasis. The second one is time to hemostasis. Then the device is absorbed in the body in equal or less than 4 weeks. That's biodegradation. This is a difficult one in the clinical investigation because you need to do a biopsy to be able to do that. That's usually not something you can do in a patient if it's not part of the normal standard of care. Device-related complications are minimal. That's very simple. That's the adverse event rate of the most important individual adverse events. And what can we come up with more? And then you preferably start to think on, together with your clinical project manager, with the clinical team, because here it becomes really important. And Caesar will show you in the next couple of slides why it's important. The indication, as said before, is various surgical procedures to stop bleeding. And then we can come up with some regulatory inclusion and exclusion criteria. Think on pregnant women, lactating women. That's usually easy to put in as exclusion criterion, and they most likely end up, has not been tested in pregnant or lactating women in the IFU. The patient population, it's a brave manufacturer because they say we are aiming at adult and pediatric patients. Pediatric patients in the US for such a device may be doable. In Europe, it may be more difficult because they want to see clinical data on kids. Sample size, the initial calculation indicated 120. So it's a decent study, not huge, but a decent size. Over to Caesar.
Yes, so then to highlight three pieces from this that would aid the overall conduct of the study. So you could say project management. So what Bianca mentioned is the intended purpose, just looking at the first one, is that there's a lot of surgical procedures that could utilize this device. So you have to think very careful about the inclusion criteria. Sorry, I mean the actually inclusion criteria, but also the sites and departments, if multiple departments could potentially be using it, and what are the logistical challenges. So is it feasible to select a broad patient group in this case that could adhere all and provide still good quality data with the protocol? Or should you be more restrictive and be more selective? But that might have some issue, some correlation with, of course, your claims. By the way, the first option, so to bring a lot of a wide variety of in and exclusion criteria is obviously good because it would represent the real life scenario, but because you'll get more biological variation, that will feed into your statistical power. So you'll probably have to also increase sample size. Well, that's up to something for a statistician. So think very careful about that. And then looking at one of the endpoints, leaving aside for now the biopsy, to assess it for weeks, I believe what Bianca mentioned, if it's really biodegraded. The endpoint of the time to hemostasis, seemingly a very easy to capture information, just to measure with a stopwatch, and you're golden. But what I would like to stress here in a protocol, you should think or have thought about a consistent manner of measuring this throughout the entire study so that everybody measures in the same way. And of course, because this happens at the OR, so during the procedure, you need to instruct or train people that are at the OR capable of capturing this information. And then you have to think, this ties into, of course, with the data capture. So that's why I run you through this process. You'll have to think of how that data will be recorded on source documentation because it's not part of the standard of care. And then that source needs to be translated into a CRF or database. And then you have to wonder, because it's endpoint, without this information, this entire patient that you enrolled would be rendered useless, you could say. So you need to make sure that the data entered is correct and is compliant, etc. So you could wonder, how frequent should you be monitoring this data? Do you need somebody on site? Can it be central, etc.? And then the final part is about eligibility. Bianca mentioned it's also for children. And then I believe definitely when you're talking about a biopsy and when it's about pre-CE, there are ethical considerations for obvious reasons to include also children. And in my experience, it's not allowed before you have proven it's effective and safe in adults. So only in case it's CE marked, you could involve children, and only if you cannot assess it in any other population, let's say. Children are quite a different population. So this is stuff that you would need experts for to give you the right input. So not only physicians, but also, like I mentioned, startup specialists, perhaps people that understand this type of requirements or ethical considerations in this particular case. So definitely consult people already at an early stage. So I think that was my last slide. Now you, Chris.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to jump back. The first two questions here, when to start working on an eCRF, when to start assessing EDC tools. So kind of broader project management. I'm going to jump back to the timeline slide here. Let me share that. So in terms of when to start working on eCRFs, really the answer is as early as possible, probably in conjunction with protocol development. which is going to be on the left side of the page here, towards the bottom. Create CIP. Between first half of year one, year two, the second half of year one into year two, creating the CIP, drafting ECRFs, really done in conjunction. So early, getting physician feedback as early as possible. Again, ensuring that you're mirroring standard of care. So CRF development alongside the protocol itself. When to start assessing EDC tools, so the actual data capture tools. If we look at that purple bar for clinical study enrollment at the beginning of that, about halfway through year 3, you really want to start looking at EDC software tools somewhere in the range of 6 to 12 months out, just depending on the tools. It can take quite a bit longer for some tools to implement and have the data capture software tool ready to go than other tools, which can be relatively faster. So really understanding the timeline for the EDC implementation is really important, but somewhere in the 6 to 12 months range for starting to assess EDC tools. Some implementations of EDCs can take 4 to 6 months themselves. Some are quite a bit faster. For Greenlight Guru's clinical solution, usually somewhere in the range of 4 to 8 weeks, so a couple months to get the tool implemented for that first study, and then it's much faster after that for subsequent studies. So just in terms of timeline, wanted to touch there. In terms of the subsequent points here I want to make, ensuring that your data capture is everything you need, but not too much. Again, ensuring with your clinical partners that you're not overburdening them with data entry that's outside of their standard of care. Ensuring that the time to complete data forms is going to facilitate participation and eager participation. Caesar mentions, fatigue can set in if participating in a particular study is a lot of time. Suddenly, they become a little bit less interested in enrolling subsequent subjects. So ensuring that it's capturing what you need, but not too much. And again, having physician review those data forms as early as possible can really help with that. How to ensure data quality. So this gets back to a couple things I mentioned before. Data validation, so automation within software to ensure that data that's coming in real time as it's being entered is being validated. To help with the quality of the data that's being entered, that can minimize the data cleanup requirements on the back end or extensive data querying. But when it comes to those activities, verifying or reviewing data, marking data as verified, whether that's source data verification, data management review, having software tools that make visibility into the progress of data review. So being able to look at the system and know which forms are needing review, which ones are completed, which ones are blocked off, etc. Software tools can really facilitate ease of visibility into the data. Querying the data, of course, you'll have multiple parties involved with data review, issuing queries, having accountability built into a software tool, ensuring that queries are not lost. I'll touch on paper a little bit later in terms of collecting data on paper, but automating those processes can greatly minimize the amount of time from data management, clinical research associates, project managers to clean up data. And then last, on ensuring data quality, how to manage data during the study, having reporting built into a platform, having real-time visibility can be very powerful in terms of data entry progress, data cleanup progress, having visibility into reports within software to, for instance, look at primary endpoints, having a report of all of your primary endpoints at a single glance, being able to cut and view your data from different perspectives, and having software to really ensure that that's easy to do will be greatly important for data management. And there are a lot of software tools that have powerful reporting built in. And again, I'll touch on paper a little bit later as well. Site training. So getting sites up and running, of course, there's the EC IRB approval process, but then site training, that can be the beginning of the challenges, if you will. If use of software tools is not intuitive, how easy is it to train sites on specifically software tools that they will be using? It should be intuitive. It should be quick. It shouldn't take hours of training. It should be 20 to 30 minutes to train sites on data capture tools. And then mid-study changes. In reality, many studies are going to have amendments or mid-study alterations to forms, adding questions, removing questions, etc. Again, that can introduce interruptions to data capture. So in understanding what does a mid-study change look like in a data capture tool? Is that easy? Is that something that you as the sponsor or the CRO can handle very themselves in an easy manner? Is that something you have to go through a data manager at the EDC provider? Understanding that will also be helpful when you're assessing EDC tools, especially. And then lastly, data access. So data managers, of course, are wanting to extract data. Software tools should make this very easy to extract data. Simply exporting data into XLS, CSV format, and setting the parameters for exports of the data should be very simple within an EDC tool. Lastly, paper. I've worked on paper studies in the past. Paper versus electronic. If anyone's worked on a paper study, very manual. Really everything I've talked about becomes very tedious. Starting with data entry, people can write things in where they don't belong and submit that, and then data cleanup becomes a lot more of a headache. Data has to be kind of transcribed, all put together into a central database, and there's transcription errors that can be introduced. Query management manually on paper, very tedious. Issuing queries via email, tracking those, reflecting those changes in the database itself, and ensuring that's all done per GCP requirements simply is overburdensome in general for studies. So just high-level data management, wanted to touch on these points, and I'll pass it back here at this point.
All right, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. There's lots of questions. So those of you who have been listening, if you haven't gotten a chance to look at the Q&A, check the Q&A tab and vote on those questions that might be relevant to you. So let's start with Ella's questions. Looks like it got the most votes. She asks, is there a requirement on performing site qualification?
I can take that question perhaps. So the ISO standard doesn't really specify anything in terms of a qualification visit, but what you are expected to do is to demonstrate people working on your study are qualified for that specific task that you have them working on. So it's, again, in that light, essential that you document that you've selected sites that are qualified, and then it's up to you to define the qualifications. So just to give you a pointer, anything medical, then somebody like myself, I'm not a doctor. I shouldn't be doing that. I'm not qualified to do that. So then you need to, of course, involve somebody that is really schooled accordingly. And so that is also after you've started commencing the study, you need to collect CVs, demonstrate people are qualified for the role they have in the study. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that's a good answer. I'm just going to go ahead and add this one on because it feels like it's under the same umbrella of questions. So maybe we can, if you want to elaborate, how much of site qualifications can be outsourced under quality agreements to CROs?
That is perfectly fine to outsource to a CRO. It's even, in my experience, a good idea to even have the CRA do this, because they need to establish good relationships with the site. That's a good start.
Okay. Great. Lisa asked the question, and I know this, I wish I'd remembered which slide this question came in, but what regulatory requirements do you have for a registry?
I can also answer. Oh, sorry, Bianca, you can do this.
Yeah, it was on one of my slides. A registry, and let's first define what a registry is, because you have two types of registry. The one is a national registry where in a country, in most cases, implants are registered in which patients they are implanted and followed over the years. That's not a registry I mean here. What's here is really a prospective study that follows the standard of care, and where the only thing you are doing is really collecting data on the patient. That requires informed consent. Usually some way of ethical committee review. And the registry per definition is a post-market study. So that usually means that there is no or limited, depending on the country, competent authority requirements. To understand the exact requirements for a country, make sure you investigate what those requirements are, because there may be differences, especially post-market, in which country in Europe is asking for which details.
I can add something here. So if the study follows standard of care 100%, maybe has an additional quality of life questionnaire, but usually follows everything else. There are countries, for instance, the Netherlands, where we're based, that currently you don't even need the ECN competent authority involved at all, because then you don't also need to inform a patient about any study-specific assessments. They do need to sign off on the data, so that you collect their data. That is typically done by means of a data transfer agreement, which is a summarized informed consent form or patient information. You just briefly explain what you're planning to do with the data, and that's it. Other countries do require still a formal approval. And again, coming back to my previous point, is a local startup specialist, I must say, probably would know the difference and would know the process to be used or to follow.
Okay. All right. So the next question comes from Thalia. If I'm saying your name correctly, apologies if not. This is a two-part question. So it started out with not a specific question, but interested in hearing perspectives on novel devices and how sponsors have framed their performance and design compared with current state-of-the-art devices. So another way of saying that question would be how successful people have been in redefining state-of-the-art. So maybe we need to talk about what state-of-the-art is, first of all.
Yes. If you look at novel devices, the first question I would ask myself is, why is the device novel? Because if the device is novel in materials, there may be very similar devices on the market that do the same. So then you can use the normal way of looking at state of the art. One of the new devices where recently the first version was approved, is a tricuspid heart valve. Up to I think it was October, November last year, the only treatment options were either repair devices of the tricuspid valve or medication. In this case, the first question is, but are you then looking at the same patient population? How comparable is it? Do the products have the same intended use? If that's the case, yes, you can still use that repair device or still use medication as your current state of the art. But it usually requires more discussion, especially because what's used for the state of the art for drugs may not as endpoint be relevant as state of the art for your device. In those cases, do a pre-submission meeting with the FDA, talk to them based on your first proposal after you have spoken to clinical experts that really are key opinion leaders. The other option, and hopefully that opens pretty quickly, is the scientific advice route with the EMA expert panels in Europe.
Yeah, I think the state of the art, sometimes we get that a little bit confused. And so keep me honest and correct me here, but oftentimes we'll put in place in our mind cutting edge. We expect that to mean cutting edge, when in reality it's
no, it's never. The already approved tricuspid valve, because it's the only one and the sales is probably very low, I wouldn't consider that as state of the art. It's a step further than state of the art. State of the art really covers where the standard patient is treated with.
Yeah, standard expectation. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer. We have time to go for a little bit further for you all. And I'll just say, if we don't get to all of the questions, we will forward these on to Bianca and Chris and Caesar. If they're able to get to them, they can answer them. I'll just make this the very last one. Will you talk about clinical strategy and custom-made medical devices? Do you have any quick thoughts on custom-made medical devices?
There are still other custom-made medical devices on the market, and if they are not custom-made because the standard of care is just a standard device, then that's still the state of the art. So determine what's the state of the art. Is it a similar custom-made device? Is it a similar non-custom-made device? In that case, so it's pretty simple. It's the same, but it may require some thinking of what is my state of the art. But once you have defined that, you can do exactly the same.
All right, thank you so much. I think we are essentially at time. So there are several other questions. We'll forward those on. If they're able to get to those, then we'll see what they're able to share. Those who've been listening, thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. If this is your first time, I hope you enjoyed it. We hope to see you again at future events. Until then, everybody, take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.